common cold.
This is from the National Vital Statistics memo, March 24th, 21, and this is a quote from that. It says, the rules for coding and selection of the underlying cause of death are expected to result in COVID-19 being the underlying cause more often than not, end of quote. And then the National Director of Vital Statistics answered the following question. The question was a good one. Should COVID-19 be listed on the death certificate only with a confirmed case? You'd think that would be an obvious question that they would answer in the affirmative. Yes, of course, if you're going to call it COVID-19, there has to be a positive test. But this National Director, Stephen Schwartz, said, quote, COVID-19 should be reported on the death certificate for all decedents where the disease caused or is assumed to have caused or contributed to death. So he's telling us there, March 24th, when at that time there were, very few even cases or deaths in the United States, and he's telling us to skew it that direction.
If I have a patient died a month ago, had fever, cough, and died after 3 days, and maybe had been an elderly, fragile individual, and there happened to be an influenza epidemic around our community, I wouldn't put influenza on the death certificate, and I've never been encouraged to do so. I would put probably respiratory arrest would be the top line, and the underlying cause of the disease would be pneumonia, and in the contributing factors, I might well put emphysema or congestive heart failure. But I would never put influenza down as the underlying cause of death, and yet that's what we're being asked to do here.
You're saying there is a massive pressure to artificially inflate the number of COVID-19 cases.
Yeah, I have directly been told to, if a patient has fever and cough or anything similar, to put this COVID-like diagnosis on the chart.
So it's really important to understand that for the first time in U.S. history, that they are coaching doctors on how to fill out death certificates. I've been a doctor over 30 years, and I've never had them try to coach me or skew me toward a particular diagnosis, never.
When this first became public, one of the first times I saw it challenged was a press briefing, and somebody in the audience, a journalist who actually seemed to have some curiosity, said something to the effect of,
can you talk about your concerns about deaths being misreported?
So I think in this country, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. There are other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem, some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
Can you be sure? You hear from coroners that that's not necessarily the case. Are you sure? How can you be confident about that? And is there any concern that it skews the data that you're trying to collect in terms of projections and things like that?
I think there's so much focus now on coronavirus. I can't imagine if someone comes in with coronavirus, goes to an ICU, and they have an underlying heart condition and they die, they're going to say cause of death, heart attack. I cannot see that happening, so I don't think it's going to be a problem.
And sure enough, what happened is we saw many, many situations in which that occurred. And sometimes they became public because family members would challenge the death. There was one in Florida, for example, where a nurse died, and it was during the height of the pandemic. And so, of course, the party line was that, of course, she died of COVID, but later her family became furious. Apparently she had kidney disease or something, and that's what killed her. And they absolutely insisted on setting the record straight. Another one, and I try to insert some humor in this once in a while so you just don't go crazy, but in Washington State, it turned out that there were a lot of inflated deaths. And one journalist asked Governor Inslee if deaths were inflated. And he said, oh, no, that's nothing but a conspiracy theory from the planet of Pluto. I'm not kidding. That's what he said.
The problem is you got some people out there who are fanning these conspiracy claims from the planet Pluto. And it's just disgusting what they're trying to say of all these crazy deep state malarkey.
Well, later on, when the records were made public, it was not a conspiracy theory from the planet of Pluto, actually. There were inflated deaths. They were even taking gunshot wounds and categorizing them as COVID deaths.
It's the first time coroner Brenda Bach has felt so frustrated by a cause of death.
These two people had tested positive for COVID, but that's not what killed them. The gunshot wound is what killed them.
We had a case in January here where we had someone die. The cause of death was due to an accidental drug overdose. The decedent had tested positive for COVID. As soon as that death came across to the state, they went ahead and classified it and put a statistic as a COVID death.
To the family, their dad died from advanced cancer. In fact, Avamir considered Fred recovered from COVID. But a few days after his death, Lincoln County Public Health reported him as their 9th COVID death. They now have 10 deaths.
I mean, that's not what he died from. He died from colon cancer, not the COVID. And places are listing loved ones as COVID deaths, and they're labeling that, and it's just not true.
So if a person died in a car accident, from alcohol poisoning, or a gunshot wound, and had COVID, would that be considered a COVID death? Well, according to the OHA, the short answer, yes.
I could give lots of examples like that, but the strange and unusual way in which the deaths were determined on the death certificates definitely inflated deaths. And the difference between dying from and with a COVID, we'll probably spend the rest of our days figuring out which was which.
The case definition is very simplistic. It means at the time of death, it was a COVID positive diagnosis. So that means that if you were in hospice and had already been given, a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means technically, even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that was the cause of the death, but they had COVID at the time of death.
The determination of the cause of death is a big deal. It has impact on estate planning. It has impact on future generations. And the idea that we're going to allow people to massage and sort of game the numbers is a real issue, because we're going to undermine the trust. And right now, as we see politicians doing things that aren't necessarily motivated on fact and science, the public's their trust in politicians is already wearing thin.
There was a report in Orlando a week or so ago where you had someone in a motorcycle accident died, unfortunately, but that was categorized as a COVID death just because the person had previously tested positive. And so, I think the public, when they see the fatality figures, they want to know who died because they caught COVID. If you're just in a car accident, and we've had other instances in which it just was no real relationship that has been counted. So we want to look at that and see, how pervasive that issue is as well.
Why would New York City want to inflate a death toll? I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's bad enough as it is. It's painful enough as it is. Why would you want to inflate a death toll?
You will always have conspiracy theories when you have very challenging public health crises. They are nothing but distractions. I can assure you, we have so much to do to protect the health and the welfare of the American people that I would just hope we just put those conspiracy stuff and let somebody write a book about it later on, but not now.